I'll write this as a continuous flowing narration. First person, older male narrator addressing the audience as family, viewers, following the same structural DNA as the analysis but with entirely new characters, setting, and plot mechanism. At my son's engagement dinner, I found my late wife's toolbox hidden behind the furnace. My daughter-in-law grabbed it out of my hands and said, "Just get rid of it. It's junk." I didn't argue with her. I waited until everyone went home, and I drove straight to my late wife's old machine shop across town. The moment I showed the ledger inside to my accountant, he set down his coffee cup, looked up at me, and said, "Frank, we need to call a lawyer right now. If you're just now joining me, take a breath, because what I found in that shop that night tore my family apart, and it's the reason I'm still alive to tell you about it." Before I go any further, hit that subscribe button and tell me down in the comments what state you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one of them. My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 68 years old, and for nearly 40 years I ran a fleet of long-haul trucking routes out of a little terminal outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I built that business with my bare hands, starting with one used rig I financed at 19% interest, and I grew it into a company with 80 trucks on the road and a payroll that fed 40 families. I worked so my children would never know what it felt like to go without. But no amount of money in this world could keep the cancer from taking my wife Miriam 3 months ago. Tonight was supposed to be a happy night. My son Caleb got engaged to a woman named Britt, and we hosted the dinner at the house, the same house Miriam decorated with her own 2 hands. I could hear the laughter in the string quartet Britt's family hired, drifting up through the floorboards while I stood alone in the basement, staring at the old green metal furnace that Miriam always joked looked like something out of a submarine. I wasn't down there to hide from the party, not exactly. I was down there because I needed 5 minutes where nobody was watching my face, waiting to see if I was finally going to fall apart. Miriam wasn't like the wives of the other men I did business with. She never wanted the country club, never wanted her name on a charity gala program. While I was out on the road learning how to squeeze every dollar out of a fuel contract, she spent her days 3 miles from our house in a converted barn she called her shop, restoring old farm engines and antique motorcycles for collectors all across the Midwest. She had grease permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, and she smelled like machine oil and the vanilla lotion she rubbed into her hands every night before bed. She never once asked me for a new car. She drove the same rusted Ford pickup for 11 years. I walked toward the furnace because I remembered, suddenly and clearly, the way she used to disappear down here sometimes late at night when she thought I was already asleep. I always assumed she was just doing laundry. I knelt down on the concrete, my knees aching, and I reached behind the furnace where the ductwork curved into the wall. My fingers brushed against something solid, wrapped in an old moving blanket. I pulled it free. It was her toolbox. Not the aluminum one she used every day in the shop. This one was smaller, wooden, hand-built, with a brass latch gone green with age. I had never seen it before in my life. I frowned, running my thumb along the dovetail joints. Miriam must have cut herself. Why would she hide a toolbox behind a furnace in a house she owned? She had an entire barn full of tools 3 miles away. I set my thumb on the latch, just about to lift it open, when the basement door swung wide behind me without so much as a knock. My daughter-in-law-to-be, Britt, came clicking down the wooden stairs in heels that cost more than my first truck payment. Britt is 29, and she carries herself like the world owes her a standing ovation just for showing up. She was wearing a cream silk dress that Caleb had put on my credit card 2 weeks earlier, insisting she needed something appropriate to meet my side of the family properly. Looking at her face now, there wasn't a trace of warmth in it, just irritation. "Frank," she said, her voice sharp, "what on earth are you doing hiding down here in the dark? Caleb's parents-in-law-to-be are asking about you. It looks strange, you disappearing at your own son's engagement party." I looked down at the small wooden box in my hands, trying to find the words. "I found this behind the furnace," I told her quietly. "I think it belonged to Miriam." Britt didn't ask another question. She stepped forward in those heels, reached out, and pulled the box straight out of my hands before I could stop her. She flipped the latch open carelessly, glanced inside for maybe 2 seconds, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "It's just a bunch of old tools and a notebook," she said, shaking her head at me like I'd lost my mind. "Junk, Frank. Your wife's barn is already full of this stuff. Just get rid of it." And with that, she tipped the box sideways and dumped the contents straight into the laundry room trash can beside the furnace, tools and all, the metal clattering loudly against the empty plastic bin. "Come upstairs," she said, already turning to leave. "People are asking for you." I stood there frozen, staring down into that trash can, listening to her heels clicking back up the stairs. A cold, heavy feeling settled into my stomach. This was Miriam's house. She hadn't been gone 3 months, and my own son's fiancé had just thrown away something my wife had gone to the trouble of hiding. I thought about Britt's cream silk dress, her diamond earrings, the casual way she'd swiped my card without asking twice. I had paid for her wedding dress fitting the week before. I had quietly wired Caleb $40,000 toward a down payment on a house 8 months ago, no questions asked, because that's what I always did. I gave my children everything so they'd never have to struggle the way Miriam and I struggled when we were young and broke and building this life from nothing. But standing in that basement, listening to the echo of Britt's heels fading up the stairs, something in me went cold and clear. I hadn't raised a daughter-in-law who respected this family. I'd financed one who respected my checkbook. I didn't chase after her. I didn't raise my voice. 40 years hauling freight across this country taught me one thing above everything else. When a wolf wanders into your yard, you don't bark at it. You watch it, quietly, and you wait. I reached into that trash can and pulled everything back out, piece by piece. Wrenches, a small brass compass, a folded cloth, and at the very bottom, a thin leather notebook, its cover cracked and soft with age. I wiped it clean with my sleeve. Miriam never kept clutter in her life. She was meticulous, precise, down to the decimal point in everything she did. If she hid this notebook behind a furnace in a house she'd lived in for 31 years, it meant something. I slid it into my jacket pocket, left the tools in a bag by the stairs, and walked out the side door of my own house without saying goodbye to a single guest. The Oklahoma night air was sharp and smelled like the first cold front of autumn. I stood in my own driveway for a moment, gravel crunching under my boots, before I even reached for my truck door handle. That's when I heard the front door open behind me. "Dad, where are you going?" It was Caleb. Britt stood just behind him on the porch, her arms crossed, that same irritated look on her face. Caleb is 34, and he used to be a good kid, before he started letting Britt do most of his thinking for him. I turned around slowly to face them both, and for the first time in his whole life, looking at my son standing there on that porch, I didn't see the boy I raised. I saw a stranger wearing his face. I asked him, plain and simple, how his fiancée could throw away his mother's belongings in a house that wasn't even finished settling from her funeral. Britt let out an exasperated breath and opened her mouth to snap back at me, but Caleb stepped in front of her smoothly, like he'd rehearsed it. He put on that gentle, concerned voice he uses when he wants something from me. "Dad, please," he said. "Britt's just overwhelmed. We both are. Seeing Mom's old things scattered around down there, it's a lot for her to process. She was only trying to help you. She was trying to clear out the clutter so you wouldn't have to deal with it yourself." He walked closer and put a hand on my shoulder, heavy and deliberate. "You've been through so much this year, Dad. Let us help carry some of this. That's all we're trying to do." It was a smooth lie, and if I'd been a weaker man, still blinded by grief, maybe I would have believed it. But Caleb made a mistake that night. He didn't stop at comforting me. He used it as a doorway into the real reason he'd followed me outside. "Actually, Dad," he continued, his tone shifting, sliding from concerned son into something closer to a salesman closing a deal. "Britt and I have been talking. About the business. About everything you're carrying right now. The trucking company, Mom's shop, the properties. It's too much for you to manage alone while you're grieving. I could take some of that off your plate. I've already had a friend of mine, he's a financial planner, draw up some paperwork. Power of attorney, just temporary, just so somebody else can handle the day-to-day while you rest." He squeezed my shoulder. "You've earned the right to slow down, Dad. Let me handle it." I didn't pull away. I just stood there in the cold and studied him, the way I used to study a competitor's freight rates before I underbid them into the ground. I noticed the new watch on his wrist, a Rolex, the kind a man doesn't buy on a mechanic's salary at the shop he supposedly still helped run. I noticed how his eyes kept flicking toward my jacket pocket, toward the small bulge the notebook made against my chest. 40 years on the road, hauling freight through every kind of small-town swindle and roadside con a man can imagine, teaches you how to read desperation hiding behind a friendly face. This was desperation, raw and urgent. He wasn't worried about my grief. He wanted control of something, and he wanted it now. I appreciate you thinking of me, I said, keeping my voice flat and tired. But I've got somewhere I need to be tonight. We'll talk paperwork another time. Caleb's smile faltered for half a second before he caught it. Of course, Dad. Drive safe. I climbed into my truck and pulled out of that driveway, watching them both shrink in my rearview mirror, standing shoulder to shoulder under the porch light, like two coyotes waiting on a wounded animal to stop moving. I drove straight across town to Miriam's shop, the converted barn where she'd spent 30 years of her life with her hands buried in someone else's broken engine. I hadn't been inside since the funeral. I unlocked the padlock with fingers that shook more than I wanted to admit, and I flipped on the fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered over her old workbenches. Everything was exactly the way she left it. Tools hung on their pegboard outlines, a coffee mug still sitting on the windowsill with a half-inch of dried coffee at the bottom. I sat down at her cluttered little desk in the back office and opened the leather notebook under the lamp. The first pages were what I expected. Notes on parts orders, customer invoices, oil viscosity ratios scrawled in her tight, precise handwriting. But halfway through, the entries changed. Dates, dollar amounts, initials I didn't recognize, references to something called the Prairie Fund. I flipped faster, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs, and near the back of the notebook I found a folded photocopy of a bank statement, an account I had never once seen in 31 years of marriage, held at a small credit union 2 counties over. I picked up the shop phone and called Miriam's longtime accountant, a careful, quiet man named Walter Osei, who had done our taxes since Caleb was in diapers. It was almost 11 at night, but he answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Walter, it's Frank. I need you to meet me at the shop right now. Bring whatever access you've got to Miriam's business accounts." He didn't argue. 20 minutes later, his headlights swept across the gravel lot outside, and he came in wearing a coat thrown over his pajamas, looking half awake until I laid that notebook open on the desk in front of him and pointed to the entries. Walter's whole posture changed. He pulled out his laptop, logged into something, and his face went the color of old paper. He set down the coffee I'd poured him without taking a sip. "Frank," he said quietly, "I need to make a phone call. I think we need a lawyer involved in this tonight, not tomorrow." I told him to sit down and explain himself before he touched that phone. Walter took a long breath and looked at me like a man about to hand over something heavy. "That account in the notebook," he said. "It's not a personal savings account, Frank. It's a private trust. Miriam set it up almost 20 years ago, structured so that it requires physical documentation. This exact notebook, cross-referenced with a notarized signature, to authorize any major transaction. It's old-fashioned, deliberately so. Hard to hack, hard to forge, because it requires the actual paper record in hand." I stared at him. "Miriam ran an engine shop, Walter. She barely made enough some months to cover the barn's electric bill." Walter shook his head slowly. "There was a whole side to your wife you didn't know about, Frank. Back in the late 90s, she started taking small amounts of profit from restoration jobs and investing them, quietly, in early industrial patents. Machine tooling designs, mostly. Things nobody else wanted yet. She had an instinct for it that I've genuinely never seen matched. She built that trust for over 2 decades, without ever touching a dime of it, without ever telling a soul." "How much?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Walter turned his laptop screen toward me. "As of the last quarterly statement I have access to, the Prairie Fund is holding just under $31 million in diversified assets. $31 million. The number hung in that cold little office like something physical. My mind flew straight back to that basement, to Britt tipping that box sideways and dumping it into a trash can without a second glance, all because she assumed a beat-up wooden toolbox from a dead woman's house couldn't possibly hold anything of value. I felt a fierce swell of pride for Miriam, quiet and sharp all at once. But it didn't last, because Walter still wasn't looking at me with relief. He was still sweating. "Frank," he said carefully, "why would you ask me to look at this tonight, of all nights? What made you come straight here?" I told him about the party, about the toolbox, about Caleb's hand on my shoulder in the driveway and the power of attorney paperwork he claimed his friend had already drafted. Walter went very still. He turned back to his screen and started typing, faster now, his jaw tight. "There's something you need to see," he said. He pulled up a secondary login screen, a client portal I didn't recognize, and there, at the top, was a pending transaction request. Submitted that same evening, time-stamped at 7:40 p.m. I did the math instantly. That was exactly when I'd been standing in my own basement, holding that little wooden box in my hands for the first time. While I was down there discovering my wife's secret, someone, somewhere, was already trying to move her secret fortune. "Where's it being routed?" I asked, my voice gone flat and cold. Walter clicked through several screens, his hands unsteady on the keyboard. "It's an outgoing wire, structured to route through 2 intermediary accounts before landing in a shell entity registered in Belize. Once it clears, it fragments into a dozen smaller accounts. After that, Frank, it's gone. Untraceable." I asked how someone even submitted a request like that on an account that supposedly required physical, notarized documentation. Walter pulled up another screen, a scanned authorization form, and turned it toward me. At the bottom were 2 signatures. One was Miriam's, one was mine. Both were forgeries, and good ones, careful, patient forgeries. Someone who had studied our real signatures for a long time before attempting this. "The confirmation code," Walter said quietly. "The 2-factor verification, it was routed to the emergency contact email on file for the trust." He looked up at me. "It's Caleb's email address, Frank." The name hit that little office like a fist. My son, the boy I'd taught to change a tire on the shoulder of I-44 when he was 14 years old. The same young man who'd stood on my porch not 2 hours earlier with his hand on my shoulder, telling me he only wanted to help carry my burdens. It all clicked into place at once, ugly and complete. They hadn't thrown that toolbox in the trash because they thought it was worthless junk. They'd thrown it away because they were certain, absolutely certain, it was already empty, that the real prize had already been secured somewhere else. Caleb's sudden urgency about power of attorney wasn't concern for my grief. It was a smokescreen, time to keep me distracted while $31 million of his mother's life's work vanished into an offshore account on the very night of his own engagement party. Walter said we needed to alert the authorities immediately. That fraud on this scale, once it crossed state and international lines, fell under federal jurisdiction. I asked him if the money had actually left the country yet. He checked. "No," he said. "Transfers of this size trigger an automatic compliance hold. It won't clear until their review finishes, sometime tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." I told him to make the call, quietly, without tripping any alert that might reach Caleb's inbox. Walter dialed a number for a federal financial crimes contact he'd worked with years before on an unrelated case, and less than half an hour later, 2 agents in plain sedans pulled into the gravel lot outside the shop. The lead agent introduced herself as Special Agent Renata Cruz, and she listened without interrupting as Walter walked her through everything on the screen. When he finished, she looked at me with something close to sympathy. "Mr. Delacroix, I'm very sorry about your wife. But what we're looking at is a serious, coordinated federal crime. My recommendation is that we move on this immediately. We can have a team at your son's residence within the hour, seize the devices, make the arrest before he realizes we're on to him." I sat with that for a moment, and then I told her no, not yet. If we arrested him tonight, over one forged wire transfer, he'd lawyer up, claim confusion, grief, temporary bad judgment, and my son would spend a few uncomfortable months paying fines before slipping right back into whatever life he was building on my dime. I didn't want to just stop the theft. I wanted to know exactly how deep it went, who else was involved, and why my son needed $31 million badly enough to forge his dead mother's signature the same night he got engaged. Agent Cruz studied me for a long moment before she nodded slowly. "You're asking to help us build a real case from the inside," she said. "That means going home tonight and acting like nothing happened. Can you do that? Sitting across the table from your own son?" I told her I could do whatever it took to protect what was left of my wife's name. She reached into her car and pulled out paperwork, a cooperation agreement, explaining that the funds would be frozen quietly on the federal end, invisible on Caleb's screen, so he'd believe the transfer was still processing normally. "You have 72 hours, she said, "before we're required to move regardless." I signed it with a hand that didn't shake. Not anymore. I locked up the shop, thanked Walter, and drove home through empty streets with a strange, cold clarity settling over me. The same clarity I used to feel right before closing a hostile buyout on a rival trucking company. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was calculating. I didn't sleep that night, not 1 minute of it. I sat in Miriam's reading chair by the window until the sun came up over the wheat fields behind the house, turning over every memory of Caleb as a boy. trying to understand at what point the son I raised became a stranger, willing to forge his mother's signature for money. When morning finally came, I called an old friend, a retired county sheriff's investigator named Roy Boudreau, who did private security consulting these days for a handful of ranchers and small business owners around the state. Roy had pulled me out of a bad situation once, years back, when a former partner tried to embezzle from the trucking company, and I trusted him the way you only trust a handful of men in your life. "Roy," I said, "I need everything you can find on my son and his fiancée. Bank records, debts, phone records, anything. Spare nothing, and I mean nothing." Roy didn't ask why. He just said, "Give me 24 hours. That evening, before Roy called back, Caleb and Britt showed up at the house unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and a stack of papers in a leather folder. Britt swept in wearing a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes, cooing about how worried she'd been about me leaving the party early the night before, how pale I'd looked, how she just wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself. Caleb set the folder down on the kitchen table, right beside the coffee I hadn't touched, and slid it toward me with a gold pen resting on top. "Dad," he said gently, "I know the timing feels strange, but the estate stuff really can't wait much longer. There are tax deadlines coming up on Mom's accounts, and if we don't get ahead of them, the state could freeze things, and it'll be a nightmare to untangle. This just gives me the authority to handle the paperwork so you don't have to think about any of it." I looked down at that folder, at the gold pen, and let my hand tremble, just slightly. As I reached for it, Britt leaned in close, resting a manicured hand on my forearm. "You don't even have to read it, Frank," she said sweetly. "Caleb's already gone through every line. Just sign where it's marked, and you can go rest." I picked up the pen. I brought it close to the paper, close enough that I could feel both of them holding their breath beside me, and then I let it slip deliberately from my fingers, clattering onto the table. "I'm sorry," I murmured, pressing my palm against my temple. "My head's pounding something awful. I can't focus on this tonight." Caleb's jaw tightened for just a second before he smoothed it back into patience. "Of course, Dad. No rush. We'll come back tomorrow." I watched them leave, and through the reflection in the dark kitchen window, I saw Caleb pull out his phone the second he thought I wasn't looking, thumb jabbing furiously at the screen, checking, I knew, on a wire transfer that was never going to clear. Roy came to the house at 6 the next morning, before the sun was even up, carrying a thick folder under his arm. We sat at Miriam's kitchen table, and he laid it all out for me without a shred of softness in his voice, because that's not the kind of man Roy is. "Caleb's in deep, Frank," he said. "He's been running a side investment operation for almost 3 years now, convincing a handful of folks at his church and around town to put money into what he's telling them is a promising ag tech startup. Only there is no startup. It's a straight-up Ponzi structure. He's been paying off early investors with money from newer ones, and it's about to collapse. He owes close to $2 million to people who are starting to ask very pointed questions, and at least 2 of them have hired their own lawyers." I sat with that, my hands wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold, and told Roy that explained everything, the sudden urgency, the forged transfer, all of it. Roy nodded slowly, but he didn't close the folder. He reached back in and pulled out a second one, thinner, and set it in front of me without a word. "There's more," he said, "and I want you sitting down for it because you already are, so just brace yourself." I opened it. The first page was a printed photograph of a condo complex in Galveston, Texas. The second photograph nearly stopped my heart. It was Caleb, standing on a balcony overlooking the water, his arm around a young woman I'd never seen in my life, both of them laughing at something out of frame. The third photograph showed him kneeling on the sand beside her, holding a baby that couldn't have been more than a year old, and the resemblance to Caleb's own baby pictures was unmistakable. "He's had a second family down there for almost 2 years, Frank," Roy said quietly. "Purchased that condo under an LLC. He tells Britt he's visiting investors down in Houston twice a month." I felt something crack open in my chest, something separate from the anger, something closer to grief for a version of my son I'd apparently never really known at all. I asked Roy how a man drowning in that much debt could possibly afford a second household. Roy flipped to the final pages, banking records, and pointed to a highlighted column. "He's been skimming it straight out of Britt's monthly allowance, the one you set up for her when they got engaged. About $4,000 a month, routed through 3 different accounts before it lands in Galveston. Britt, for all her cruelty, was being played every bit as badly as I was, and for one brief moment I felt something almost like pity for her, before Roy reached into his bag one more time and slid a small digital recorder across the table. "Before you feel too sorry for her," Roy said, his voice hard now, "listen to this." He pressed play. It was a recording, pulled from Britt's cloned phone data, a voicemail she'd left for Caleb 4 days before Miriam's memorial service, back when Miriam was still in hospice, still barely conscious in the back bedroom of this very house. Britt's voice, bright and casual, filled that quiet kitchen. "The lawyer says we need her actual signature on the account transfer, not just yours. The hospice nurse takes her break around 7, remember? I can slip in and get it handled while nobody's watching. Just have everything ready to go the second I text you." My hands went cold around that coffee mug. Roy reached into his bag one last time and pulled out a tablet, his face grim. "There's security footage from the hospice camera you had installed for insurance purposes, Frank. I need you to see it before this goes any further." He pressed play. The footage was grainy, time-stamped 4 days before Miriam passed, and it showed the quiet back bedroom, the soft rise and fall of the oxygen machine, Miriam's frail hand resting on top of the quilt she'd made herself 30 years earlier. The door opened. Britt walked in, glanced once toward the hallway, and pulled a folded document and an ink pad from her purse. She lifted Miriam's limp hand, pressed her thumb into the ink, and stamped it 3 times across the bottom of a page, methodical, unhurried, before folding the papers back into her purse and walking out without so much as touching my wife's hair or whispering a single word to her. She never once looked at Miriam's face. I couldn't speak. I sat there at that kitchen table and wept, a raw, ugly sound tearing out of my chest that I hadn't made since I was a boy, because everything I'd told myself about Caleb, that maybe I'd spoiled him, maybe I'd made him soft and entitled but not cruel, shattered in that instant. Spoiling a child might make them lazy or careless with money. It does not make them stand in a dying woman's room and use her own hand to steal from her. That is not a failure of parenting. That is something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for and didn't want one. Roy sat quietly and let me have that moment, the way an old friend does, without trying to fix it. When I finally wiped my face and looked up at him, I told him there was no sympathy left in me anymore. Not for either of them. Roy nodded slowly, and then he told me there was one more thing, and I felt my stomach drop all over again. "Frank, since you refused to sign those papers last night, they've had to change their plans. I pulled some emails off Britt's server this morning. She's been in contact with a doctor here in town, a man named Dr. Feld, who's had his license flagged twice before for writing questionable prescriptions to wealthy families. They're planning to have him come out to evaluate you, Frank. Claim you're showing signs of early dementia brought on by grief. There's a sedative Feld's already written a script for. Britt's plan is to work it into your food over the next couple of days, enough to bring on confusion and tremors, enough to make a psychiatric hold look legitimate to anyone watching. Once that happens, Caleb petitions for guardianship over your entire estate." I sat in that kitchen in absolute silence, understanding for the first time that this had stopped being about money hours ago. My own son was planning to drug me and lock me away to finish what the forged signature had started. The grief in me hardened into something colder and more useful. I told Roy we no longer had 72 hours. We didn't have 12. I called Agent Cruz from the shop that afternoon and told her everything. The Ponzi scheme, the second family, the hospice footage, the plan to drug and institutionalize me. She went quiet for a long moment before she said, "Frank, we can move on this within the hour if you want us to." I told her not yet. One more evening. I wanted to look my son in the eye when it finally came apart. The way you look a man in the eye across a negotiating table right before you take everything he thought he'd already won. That night, Britt cooked my favorite meal, pot roast, the way Miriam used to make it. And I understood exactly what that gesture meant, sitting on the plate in front of me. Caleb poured wine with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady, glancing at his phone every few minutes under the table. Britt slid the leather folder across to me again, along with a second document tucked beneath it, printed on the letterhead of Dr. Feld's clinic. "Just a routine wellness check, Daddy," she said, sliding the gold pen toward my hand. "We just want to make sure you're doing okay." I picked up that pen, let it hover an inch above the signature line, long enough that I could hear both of them holding their breath across the table, and then I set it down gently, capped it, and looked up at my son. "I know about the Ponzi scheme, Caleb," I said. My voice no longer frail, no longer tired. carrying the full weight of 40 years spent negotiating with men far more dangerous than him. I know about Galveston. I know about the baby down there who shares your face. And I know, I said, reaching into my jacket and setting Miriam's leather notebook down in the center of the table, exactly what your fiancé did to your mother's hand 4 days before she died. Britt's face went white. Caleb's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I laid the photographs from Roy's folder across the table, one by one. The condo, the woman, the child, and Britt snatched them up with shaking hands, staring at the proof of a betrayal that ran even deeper than the one she'd helped orchestrate against me. "Tell me this isn't real," she said to Caleb, her voice cracking. He couldn't answer her. He was staring at the notebook, at the photographs, at the sheer unraveling of everything he'd built, and something in his face broke loose entirely. He lunged across the table at me, hands reaching for my collar, just as the front door of my own house came off its hinges behind us, and federal agents flooded into that dining room with their weapons drawn, shouting for both of them to get down on the ground. Caleb froze mid-motion, suspended over the ruined pot roast, and I watched the fight drain out of him as the cuffs closed around his wrists. Britt collapsed into her chair, sobbing, reaching for me, begging me to fix this, to tell them it was all a misunderstanding, that I loved her, that family forgives family. I looked down at her kneeling there on my kitchen floor, and I thought about Miriam's hand, stamped 3 times into an ink pad while she lay dying and unable to stop it. "You called her Toolbox junk," I told her quietly. "I'm just finally taking the junk out of this house." 8 months have passed since that night. Caleb pleaded guilty to wire fraud, securities fraud, and elder financial abuse, and the judge handed him 11 years in a federal facility outside of Fort Worth. Britt avoided prison time by cooperating fully against him, testifying to every detail of the plan, but the government seized everything purchased with stolen investor money, which was nearly everything she owned. I severed every financial tie to her completely and legally. She writes to me sometimes. I don't open the letters. Using the recovered Prairie Fund, I purchased the old barn where Miriam spent 30 years of her life and turned it into the Miriam Delacroix Trade School, a fully funded program teaching young people from struggling families across rural Oklahoma how to work with their hands the way she taught herself. Engine repair, welding, precision machining, real skills that put food on a table without asking anyone for permission. I stood outside it last week and watched a group of 18-year-olds walk through the doors for the first time, and something in my chest finally settled. Quiet. After 8 months of carrying a weight I didn't know how to put down. Blood gets you a relationship. It doesn't get you a family. Loyalty does that. Respect does that. I spent decades pouring everything I had into 2 children, thinking that giving them comfort would give them character. And I learned the hard way that money poured into an empty place doesn't fill it. It just makes the emptiness more expensive. If you've got someone in your life you love enough to give everything to, watch closely what they do with it when nobody's checking, because that's who they really are. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments, have you ever had to walk away from someone in your own family to protect yourself? I read every single story you leave me.